Welcome to the Weights and Plates podcast. I am Robert Santana. I am your host, along with Trent Jones, my co-host.
What's going on, brother? Brother!
Not much, brother. I still think that story's funny when you said the guy's like, well, if you want 20 pounds of lean mass, you got to take steroids, brother.
Better get on steroids, brother. Man, I wish I could find that guy again. We could interview him on the show.
Do you think he's still lifted?
I don't know. I like to think he is. I like to think he's one of those lifers. He probably trains at Metroflex, because
Right.
this was Arlington, Texas. He's probably one of those lifers at Metroflex. He's like 64, and he's just booking it.
So he trained with Ronnie Coleman.
Trained with Ronnie Coleman. Trained with Branch Warren. I did. It's kind of funny. When I was 14, 15, I had a job in the summer as an assistant counselor at Camp Thurman, which was this like kids day camp that's in South Arlington area.
Right.
And it's not far from Metroflex. And one of the counselors that I assisted, they all had like names they would take on,
Right.
like Toast, I think was his name.
Toast.
Yeah, they would all have like, kind of names that were camp names. And anyway, so Toast, he was like kind of jacked, not super, not yoked or not a crazy physique or anything, but you could tell like even at age 14, 15, when I knew nothing about this stuff, I could tell he was pretty jacked. And he trained with Branch Warren. He was kind of a casual training partner there. As I remember, one of his buddies who was not, this guy might have been a pro. I don't know. He was certainly not a name that's famous. But he came by one time with Toast, and I remember seeing this guy. And
Did he eat toast?
I don't know. That's a dumb name. But I remember seeing this guy, this friend of his that was training at Metroflex, who definitely looked like an IFBB pro type guy. I just remember he couldn't turn his neck, so like somebody said his name, he was like yo, and he has to like turn his whole body. He's got to rotate his whole torso in order to look over because his traps were just, I guess, so fucking big, he couldn't turn his neck.
Well, that's a good problem to have, right?
Yeah, I guess so. So anyway, Toast ran in some interesting circles there at Metroflex. He probably knew the guy at GNC too.
Do you know Ronnie?
I don't know. Probably. I have to imagine he would have met him because this would have been 2003, 2004. So Ronnie was a cop for either the Arlington PD or maybe it was Grand Prairie PD. I can't remember which police force he was working for, but he was a cop up until like year 2000 or so. And then I think he went full-time bodybuilder after that. And he competed until like 2005, 2008. 10, somewhere around there. I don't know much about bodybuilding careers, but yeah, it was certainly the same time when Ronnie was at his peak.
I think Ronnie was early 2000.
Yeah.
So
anyway, there you go. Toast and the guy from GNC.
What was the guy from GNC's name?
I don't know.
Was his name Hulk Hogan?
He definitely looked like man, it's kind of funny. I hadn't thought about this before, but there are a number of guys that were in my social sphere. They weren't friends. I wouldn't even call them acquaintances, but they're just people that I knew that left an impression looking back on it. I didn't think about it at the time, but there were these like really jacked guys that I knew in my sort of social circle. And it would be things like that. It would be the guy at the GNC store who's like, you better get on steroids, brother. It's the guy at the camp who's friends with bodybuilders. It's my junior high football coach, one of them. I remember his name, Coach Mashburn. This would have been 8th grade, so I would have been 14. He was a reservist. I think he was a Marine. Yeah, he was in the Marine Reserves. And he had served in, what would that have been, Afghanistan? Yeah, Afghanistan would have been prior to that, right? So this has been 2003, 2004. So he had done a tour, had come back, and he was in the reserves, and he took this teaching job for like 2 years at my junior high. Mm-hmm. And this guy was just huge. I mean, that guy was definitely on gear. Like, there's no way.
Course.
There's no way. But he was just massive, like huge neck, like 20-inch neck. And yeah, that guy, I remember he would lift in the gym, and like this was the very first time we'd ever touched weights. It was certainly the first time I'd ever touched weights. We had a little gym in that junior high, and the 8th graders were allowed to lift. 7th graders didn't, 8th graders did. And so he was like the first guy to introduce us all to lifting. And he would do crazy stuff. Like he would just yell, and like he was benching like 405 for some reps, and he would just scream in the gym and then rack it, and he'd go write like profanities up on the whiteboard there. Yeah, it was wild. That guy didn't last very long, but he left an impression.
I remember, well, I was thinking of a couple of things. I have some guys like that too, but, you know, I saw a while back that Mr. Hulk Hogan got fact-checked and told that not everybody's his brother.
I don't know. I'll let you. Do you want to tell him that? I don't. You want to deliver that message?
Did you see that one?
Yeah, I think I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah. Fact check.
Was that
not
an Onion?
that
sounds like an Onion article.
It probably is. No, there was a guy. So there were a couple guys. So there was this guy that worked at this supplement shop that I used to go to because they had Sci-Fit protein powder, and it tasted like a fucking milkshake. That stuff's good. I don't know if they still make it anymore. This was 22 years ago, probably.
Okay.
23.
Yeah,
22 years
that's
ago.
rare for something to taste good back then.
Yeah,
protein used
exactly.
to taste terrible.
Exactly.
Oh,
This
man.
one tasted like, it felt like you were cheating, dude. It tasted like a milkshake. It was called Sci-Fit. And
Okay.
we'd go to this place in Joliet, Illinois. So it's like a city south of Chicago, about 45 minutes, you know, for you Illinoisans or Chicagoans that you know where that is. And we would get this stuff, and they had this guy working there who at the time was probably in his 40s, early 50s. He had, you know, his hair was white, you know. I think it was salt and pepper at that point, so probably 40s. And he said he was just helping out there, right? And I remember going in, and what did he tell us? He said, there's a couple things he said. First, he's like, shit, what did he say? I think he might have told us to drink more milk because he was definitely from Rip's era, you know?
Okay, yeah.
But the two big things that were happening was there was a guy who you and I would consider jacked now, but he was like, you know, not ripped. He was like this big fucking dude.
Yeah.
You know, no gut,
Swole.
just not super. Yeah, just swole. He had pretty defined arms, I remember. But he just was like a big dude, big traps, big shoulders. And he's like, he was telling us, he's like, you guys got to eat big if you want to get big. You want to look like this guy, right? And I was like, dude, that guy's huge. And then there was this one skinny guy in our group who had abs, and that's all he had. He was like $155 at 6 foot. He's like,
Right.
Yeah, when he said that, I was like, nah. And I'm like, seriously, dude, you don't want to be that big? What the fuck is wrong with you, you know? So this whole Fight Club thing was starting to pick up steam around this era, you know? But I remember that. He's like, yeah, you want to look like this guy, right? And he's like this big, jacked fucking dude, you know?
Yeah.
And then he told us saturated fat's not that bad. And then I was like, whoa, you know, because everything I'd heard was that saturated fat
Right.
is
That was
bad.
the
you know,
food pyramid
heart.
days. Yeah.
Yeah. And this was 2002. So he's like, no, it's not that bad. It doesn't cause heart disease. And then I'm like, what? He's like, you should do your research. He's like, look at the Eskimos. He's like, they live off whale blubber, and that's nothing but saturated fat. Why aren't they dropping dead of heart attacks, you know? And, you know, he was mostly right on that. And, you know, later on, we found out that a lot of that stuff was bullshit and oversold. But the bigger thing is just, it depends on demographics. Some guys are sensitive to certain diets more than others. I've certainly seen that in working as a nutritionist. And I remember thinking he was crazy, you know, he'd say saturated fat. Because I think that's what he told us to drink. He told us to drink whole milk and eat whole eggs. And I was like, what?
Yeah, right. Yeah, eggs were.
You know?
See, yeah, and that was a big deal back then because you know you couldn't just go on the internet and find alternative information.
No, there just wasn't a lot of information on the
you
internet.
just had
like
to
there is
know.
now.
Yeah, there just wasn't out. It wasn't a lot out there, and then you certainly couldn't you couldn't search it in a way to like hone in on.
No, we
yeah.
sat on forums.
Yeah, there's forums, and then so that was the way most people would have to connect is like find the right forum, and then a lot of it though was still you had to know the guy at the gym who had read the studies and had practical experience, and you had to be at the right gym to know that guy, right?
Dude, this guy knew, man. I remember he was like, "Look, guys, you want big arms? Do chin ups." And then I'm like, "What? Like really? No curls?" He was like, I mean, he's like, you can curl, but you really need to get strong at chin-ups if you want big arms. I remember him saying that.
Right. So today we want to talk about losing weight for the obese person. And we realized, like, when we were kicking around this topic, we're like, oh, we've talked about weight loss for the person with the dad bod, the skinny fat person. And a big part of that, right, was first building a large base of muscle, which involves, for a lot of people, gaining weight when they're in that position. But then at some point, they may want to strip some fat off that they had gained in that process. And so they would have to go on a cut later down the road. And then we have addressed in passing on multiple episodes what someone who was starting out from a over fat or obese standpoint would do, but we haven't dedicated a whole episode to it. So that's what we wanted to do today, is talk about what do you do if you are obese, which I want you to kind of help us understand, what does that mean from a clinical standpoint? What do you do? How do you approach weight loss when you're in this boat?
First of all, it's kind of hard to even classify obese anymore because it just doesn't take into account enough variables. So
yeah,
if you go off BMI, clinical obesity is a BMI of 30 or greater, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Only accounts for height and weight, so it doesn't account for structure, frame size. Doesn't account for muscle mass, So if you're a lifter, getting to a BMI of 30 might happen if you get strong enough.
Yeah. I touched 30 a couple of times.
Yeah, I'm getting close to it now, So then people say, use body fat percentage. Well, body fat percentage, again, it's the ratio of muscle and fat. The limits of the instruments used to measure body composition or body fat percentage are one problem. That's a whole nother discussion. But the main issue there is it tends to focus much on the percent fat and not the total body weight for height,
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Because you could be 30% body fat because that 70% muscle mass is a very low raw number,
Yeah. So you could be a relatively normal body weight and be 30%.
Exactly. So
normal in terms of like not extreme.
Yeah. It doesn't take into account body weight.
Right.
You're not looking at a percentage, and the person who looks at that at face value might want to get very skinny to get the fat percentage low. Then there's waist circumference, which I think works good most of the time. But again, if you got a guy who's 6'8", is a 40-inch abdominal circumference, the same as a guy who's 5'8". You know what I mean?
Obviously not. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So I think the theme here that I've seen with all these various ways of classifying whether somebody's too fat or not is that it works for average height. Once you start getting to the average height, average frame size, whatever that means, I guess say small to medium frame. If you want to just throw it there,
Right.
Because very small frame, that's, not the majority. Very large frame is not the majority. So small to medium frame people that are of, mediocre height, 5'9" for a guy, 5'4" for a woman. I think it's probably true most of the time for an untrained person. When somebody's trained, it all goes out the window. So how do we assess this then, right? I think, waist circumference is probably decent for a dude, hip circumference is probably decent for a woman. Mm-hmm. And the bigger that is, the more likely you probably are carrying too much fat to the point where it's impairing your ability to function, impairing how you feel, and probably causing some metabolic disturbances if you're old enough or fall into certain demographic groups that are at higher risk for some of these problems, right?
Right.
So, if you have a big bowling ball gut, okay, you're probably fat,
Yeah. Yeah.
Plain and simple. If you're active and strong, that's better. Fat guy who's strong and aerobically conditioned is, healthier or less unhealthy than a fat guy who's, sitting on his ass eating Cheetos all day, So yeah, if you have a big giant belly or, a lot of body fat in your lower body, if you're an exaggerated pear shape, just kind of, I think I like Ansel Keys, his response to this. He was a guy who, kind of coined or popularized BMI. When asked about this, he's like, if you want to know if you're too fat, just look in the mirror and, something to that effect.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's so subjective. Like the objective measurements don't always apply, but if if you're fat, okay.
Right.
And if you have body image issues and you have a normal BMI and a high fat percentage, that's a different topic that we hit on a lot. But, if you're tend to be very round, that's probably one way to look at it. If you tend to be very, very round to the point where it's impairing your physical function, you could probably afford to lose some pounds. Now, some people are just going to have that shape no matter what. A better diet will reduce the magnitude of it, so it's not so exaggerated. A fat guy who eats well isn't going to be as fat as if he eats like shit. There are things you can do to make the situation less shitty. Just like I'm never going to deadlift 700, but I've gotten myself over 5. If I manage to stay healthy, might hit 6, and that's, because I enjoy lifting heavy weights. I've committed myself to it, right? But take someone even less committed, and I wouldn't say that I'm athletic. I have a 24-inch vertical jump. My VO2 max, the best was like 57 mils per kilogram per minute, or like 4 liters, I think. So I'm pretty mediocre in terms of athletics, but, I guess if you look at norms, I'm slightly above average,
Yeah,
whereas,
right.
The top of the top's 40-inch vertical jump and has VO2 maxes in the 60s and 70s, 80s. I think the 80s is more rare, but 60s and 70s, that's, elite endurance athletes. So,
Sure.
Okay, I'm maybe, half a standard deviation from the mean, maybe 1,
Right.
But, when I look at people who struggle, people who tend to just look at food and gain weight, or people that spend years to, deadlift 315, they have to work a little bit harder,
Right.
to be less below average,
Yeah. I mean, I think, so that's really helpful. So first of all, you can't get too tied up in the official designations of these things, because, it definitely does not tell the whole story. But I'll say, like, I've primarily have experience with what I would classify as obese men. And I would say that, like, a typical guy in this category would be, let's say, 5'10", 285 pounds. Let's say, that's kind of, or 5'10", let's say 5'10", 250 to 300, and not extremely strong, right? So we're going to count out the like world-class lifters, because there are some. Who was it? Serge Redding, the great Serge Redding. He was 5'8", 300 or something like that. But he also clean and pressed over 500 pounds, so he doesn't count. But yeah, these are guys who are either untrained or sort of, novice to early intermediate sort of level of training, and they're, average height 5'8", 5'10", somewhere between 250 and 300 pounds. That's who I have seen in this category. Now, there are a couple people that I have worked with that are outside of that, on the more extreme end, 400 pounds, 420 pounds, 430 pounds. But I'd say most of the people who are in this sort of obese category this year are more in the, like, sort of high 200s at a normal male body height. Does that sound about right to you?
Yeah, that's probably right. If you're a dude of normal height, 250 to 300, I'd say you probably have some weight to lose.
Right. Yeah.
If you're squatting and deadlifting 800, maybe not.
Right. Yeah. So obviously we're excluding that. These are people who are squatting, not even their body weight maybe, or slightly above body weight.
That's right.
Yeah. So, okay. So what do these people do? Like, so do you, when we talk about the skinny fat person, or the person that has more of the dad bod body type, we've been harping on and on and on about how they really don't need to focus on the scale. They need to focus on the weight on the bar and getting their lifts stronger and gaining muscle mass. And the body fat percentage, the body composition, will right size itself over time. But what about for this person, right? What about this obese person who is, definitely has some weight to lose? How do you approach the person in, let's say, the novice phase of training? Are you just going to have them lift? Or are you going to have them focus on trying to lose any weight at first, or what?
I've said it many times. A fat guy who's strong looks better than a fat guy who's not strong, and he functions better too. Yeah. So the skinny fat guy needs to not worry about fat at all, because the fatness, in terms of percent fat, the higher ratio of fat, is really due to a lower ratio of muscle. It's funny how we can sit here and come up with norms for how much fat you should have, but there are no norms for how much muscle you should or could have or benefit from. Nobody's looking at that. Like, you don't really see studies with associations between percent muscle mass for a given BMI and all these health markers. But you see all these correlations between a fat percentage or high BMI and all these other things, right? Like they haven't normalized muscle for height and weight.
You just made me realize, this thought just popped in my head that we would have such different conversations if the term wasn't body fat percentage, if instead it was muscle mass percentage.
Exactly.
Like I think it would turn a lot of these conversations on their head. But when you say body fat percentage, you're putting emphasis on the body fat part of the ratio, and you're de-emphasizing the muscle mass part of the ratio. Just by what we call it.
What I'd like to do is get one of these big population-wide data sets. I mean, I wouldn't want to do it, but I want to get it on paper on it. I'd like to pay a biostatistician to do it and normalize percent muscle mass or even lean body mass for a given BMI,
Yeah.
Or fat percentage for a given BMI, and start looking at correlations between that and all these health markers. When you control for muscle mass, what do we learn? They never look at it that way.
Yeah.
Or if they do, they write it up in a way that people can understand,
Right.
But yeah, a guy who's 250 to 300 is probably a fat guy, and heavier is probably even fatter, right? We're not talking about Eddie Hall here, who was 375 with abs,
Right.
And then females, closer they get to 200 plus, for what average height of 5'4" to 5'7", most women are shorter, sometimes they're shorter.
Right.
Typically once you start getting into the upper hundreds, once women start getting in the upper hundreds, untrained, and over 200, then that's usually the demographic that calls me up for diet coaching,
Right.
Because women are never fat. We're not stupid here,
That's right.
Yeah.
Gotta be careful about how you frame this.
Yeah. No. God, no. I had a returning client the other day, and she's very strong, very athletic, and very lean. She's explosive. She cleaned 100 kilos at 115 pounds, clean 220.
Wow. Yeah.
She's 5'6". She's one of my most athletic clients I've ever trained. And she had a diet coaching, and I'm like, oh, so you had a diet coaching this time. You are serious, because the problem with these natural athletes is they have these attention spans that kind of fade, because they're fucking awesome. And it's hard to, and sometimes it's like, well, they never think they're good enough, but then there's that thing, right, where, they're hitting some pretty awesome numbers, so
right. Yeah.
like they're going to go from really strong to, a little bit less strong, but still really strong,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but anyways, she's like, well, yeah, unless you don't think I need it, then I'm like, well, a lady never needs it. I'm not going to fail an IQ test.
Yeah, I know some people don't even like using the word diet, right? Like they don't like saying diet coaching. It's nutrition coaching or whatever.
And we're just trying to have fun here, but
yeah.
No, my point is, typically when I have women hiring me that are, 5 foot to probably 5'7", 5'8", I'd probably say 5 foot to 5'6" is realistically what I see the most of, because just a lot of women aren't super tall. I get them sometimes, but, most women are under 5'7". So, 5 foot to 5'6", typically the weights that I tend to see are in the mid to high hundreds, at baseline, and they want to lose weight, sometimes over 200. But typically it's the mid to high hundreds, untrained, no lifting background. And we work from there, right? So what you do in this situation is you train these people, male or female, just like any other novice. They're going to squat press, deadlift, bench press, power clean, and chin up. And, they're going to alternate the bench press and the press after right away. They're going to alternate the deadlift and the power clean after a couple weeks. And they're going to do chin ups or pull downs if they're not strong enough to do chin ups. And we're going to add a few pounds each time. And typically, if you have a lot more weight to lose and you're a novice, you got two things going at once. This is a foreign stimulus physically, so you're going to build muscle and get stronger, but then you're pulling calories back, cleaning up your diet, you're losing fat. You could do both at the same time, and to think about it too much, right?
Right.
What I've tended to see is over time, once they get out of that novice phase, now they're no longer a novice. Now we got an overweight, obese, whatever word you want to use, intermediate, who now has higher recovery demands. That person now behaves just like the skinny guy who got to intermediate by gaining weight.
Right.
Recovery matters, and you see weight fall off the bar as they try to lose more body weight.
Yes.
And I think of this guy that I trained years back, and he's still with me. He was 320, 325, I think, when he started. We got him all the way down to 230. And
wow. Yeah.
Novice linear progression to start, but then eventually, achy joints, missed reps, all the same shit you see with the skinny guy, except he was like experiencing this at 275, 280.
Right.
So we had to put him on an intermediate program to get the rest of the weight off. We were resetting some things, pulling stress back, just basically treating it as another stressor that he needs more recovery from versus, well, I'm losing weight, I'm getting weaker. That's true, but let's think of the mechanism there, right? Your body demands more food, more recovery for the intensity, volume, and frequency that you're doing. So we have to adjust those variables to allow for additional recovery. Now, do we typically see PRs with weight loss? Not usually. Typically in the higher rep ranges you may, because you can recover from that a little bit better. You still have to manage that so that you don't get achy joints from that as well. And I did do that with him. I tried higher rep ranges. This was years ago. Mm-hmm. But to get down from the high 200s to the low to mid 200s, I had to train him just like the normal weight to lighter guy. I had to adjust it so that he can complete his workouts, not miss reps, and not have everything hurt.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it makes sense. I mean, in some sense too, we don't like to talk about ratio of, like how much you're lifting relative to your body weight that much, but that's really what's happening too. If you go from 300 pounds to 250, even if your lifts went down, your ratio may have stayed the same, or maybe even have gone up, of how much you're lifting relative to body weight. And that matters, that's it changes the amount of stress that you're experiencing. So, I think that's something that happens. And then, of course, along with that is the changing in leverage, which we talked about on the show, right? You lose some of that gut, the inches come off. It really changes the feel of the squat in particular, but also bench press, maybe even the press. Okay, so yeah, that makes sense. So if someone is novice or untrained, so that they're in the novice linear progression right now, or they have not started it yet, they can expect to be able to lose weight and run the program and just do it as written until it runs out. Do you have a target body weight loss per week or per month that you're looking for?
It depends on the person's behaviors, their history with food, but typically the general numbers I give are about 0.5% to 1% per week, is what we try to do. But sometimes if these guys lose a pound a week, I know that's lower, so if they're 250 or let's say they're 300, 1% is
3 pounds.
3 pounds,
a week, right? Yeah.
1.5 to 3 pounds. But if they lose 1 and they have, they're feeling real hungry, all right, let's roll with that. They might lose 2 the next week, then 1. It's not really linear every time, but ideally, on average, you want 0.5% to 1% per week. But don't hold yourself super strict to that because life happens. Some weeks that doesn't happen because shit will happen. You'll go off the diet. You're not going to have 12 perfect weeks most of the time.
Right.
Some people will though, but most people won't.
Yeah. No, that totally makes sense. I mean, and too, there's also I found that bigger people have bigger swings in things like, body weight gain, let's just say body weight fluctuation due to like hydration, Mm-hmm. So you could eat a bunch of salt and then take in a bunch of water, and then you might have a swing that's 5-10 pounds up. Mm-hmm. Whereas I might have the same swing for me in the same situation. Like I eat a pizza and I drink a whole bunch of water, might be plus 3 pounds, they might be plus 10.
That's right.
So, okay. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So what do you think are some of the big pitfalls that people make in this process in terms of getting stuck losing weight? Because I'll be honest here, I haven't trained that many people who are in this category, but I have done a handful, and I don't bill myself as a diet coach. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm not an expert in that. I offer some advice, and I know some things about it, but I'm not an expert, and I don't specifically coach that. I just coach the training. But I have not had a whole lot of success with people who are very, very overweight or obese, whatever you want to call it, losing that much weight. They get stronger, absolutely. We get them a lot stronger, but they tend to stall out on losing weight. And I'm not always sure how to, like what the behavioral breakdown is.
Well,
the reason for that.
We don't know everything that's going on, but like anything else, there's a genetic component. Some people just get fat easier than others.
Yes, that definitely seems to be true.
For various reasons. A lot of people like to shit on that because if you just look at things at face value, like go back 50 years even, there are just fewer people that were that fat. But that doesn't mean that these same types of people weren't walking around. The world was just different. We didn't eat the same things. We didn't have the advancements in mass food production that we have now. And we tended to be more active. There's so many variables there, right?
Yeah, sure.
But the point is, there was a time in history where there just weren't a lot of fat people, but there were probably a lot of people still that could get that fat that just weren't exposed to certain stimuli to do it, right?
Yeah, sure.
But there's a genetic component. There always has been. I think that we just have an environment right now that favors the expression of that genetic phenotype. And we have food everywhere. You get lots and lots of calories very easily, and you don't have to go very far for it, right?
Right, and lots of stressors. Lots of outside of food, right? So outside of food and training, right? Lots of stressors, extracurricular stressors. Let's put it that way.
Well, I don't really know how to quantify this, but it just seems that people are responsible for more things in their job now, especially if you work a corporate or government job. I just see I've watched this trend over the last 20 to 30 years of having to wear a lot of hats to do what used to be just one thing. There's not just, you can't just do one thing. In fact, I was shunned for that at my first run of the PhD. Robert, you just want to do one thing. That's not how it works. You have to be able to manage multiple tasks at one time, and you can never spend too much time on one thing. I'm like, how do you get good at anything, I mean, that's more of a philosophical conversation that, we can have aside. If anybody's in Phoenix wants to have a beer and bitch about that, give me a call. But the point is that, that's the thing now. If you work in corporate or government, it's not just one task that you're responsible for. I don't know that it was ever just one task. I'm not an expert on this, but I have a feeling that people tended to have a more narrow set of responsibilities in these types of jobs years back. And I think that when you're constantly juggling, my opinion on this is it reduces you to mediocrity, which creates stress because you're not awesome at anything. You're just trying to fucking stay above water on all these all these different things, and that stress follows you outside of work,
Absolutely.
And that's just one type of stress. A lot of other things have changed too. There's, that we need to get an expert in for this shit because I don't want to speak out of my little realm. I have opinions, but they're, everybody does, just like we all have assholes, right? But that's something that I've observed. That's why I'm not in academia. I'm not in a big corporation. I knew from a young age that wasn't for me. But that was probably the biggest reason. It's like, I want to do my thing. I want to do this narrow set of tasks, and I want to get good at them,
Yeah.
But, you can go down the list. We should get, what's his name, Pewter back on here. See what he has to say.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Well, yeah, I don't think we have to look very far to find a lot of other stressors there. So, and I think we, it seems like, I don't want to say I think we know. It seems obvious to me, but I don't know what what science really has to say about this. But that higher stress levels, higher cortisol levels, whatever you want to call that, however you want to quantify that, makes it harder to lose weight. Seems like it just makes, it changes the hormonal milieu, has a lot of knock-on effects that make it more difficult to lose weight. So, yeah, that's certainly an issue. So for those people who are, weight loss resistant, let's call it, what do you do? Do you have them, like, what kind of strategy do you have to work with them? Because if they're still, let's say, okay, so here's a scenario I've run into before, where we've got someone who's, again, average height male, we'll call them 5'10", and they're 285, and they have now run through a novice linear progression, and they've worked hard. They've gotten their squat up into the 300s. They've got their deadlift up into the 300s. They're benching in the 200s, pressing, etc. But they're still hanging around about 285, much more muscular than they started. So the body composition has changed, but they're still pretty overweight, and they may have some other issues too. Like they might have elevated A1C levels. Maybe their lipids are a little messed up. Some other health markers that are concerning.
Well, the big issue here is we don't supervise people eating and living their life. That's not what we do. We consult on it, and we can look at pictures, we can look at logs, self-reported data that we can assess, but ultimately modifying eating behaviors, a lot of it falls on the individual. We're just here to reinforce and hold them accountable for the most part, and obviously provide information when it's needed.
Right.
But it's been my experience that because of the internet, the information, most of it's been acquired. A lot of the time I'm clarifying things, but I'm not having to basically spell things out from the ground up like, it's your first time ever talking about nutrition for a lot of these people. They've been around the block. But the issue is just behavioral. They've created these habits around food, and, I try to listen to what they say, try to give advice on what some alternative strategies are that make sense for their lifestyle. A lot of it's just reinforcing, and it helps if they're working with a mental health professional or somebody like that is more well-versed in the psychology of it. That's not what I do. What I do is I gather information from the person and try to find solutions that I think might work. And I try to use solutions that have worked for others. I try to share things. And a lot of it's just reinforcing and reminding the person that they need to stay on track, But typically when they are that heavy, there tends to be a lot more of a psychological connection there, in addition to the genetic makeup. Just because, you didn't win the genetic lottery doesn't mean you have to be completely and utterly fucked. You can make the situation better with an active effort, but then a lot of it's, accepting that there are certain things you just can't do anymore, and that's where I always run into walls with these people. Like the two biggest problems I run into with diet, especially in the overweight, obese category, is snacking and eating out, especially snacking. I remember one of the first guys I worked with in the context of barbell training, who was really big. When I told him to get the snacks out of the house, I got such a severe emotional reaction from him. Like, that's just never going to happen. And I told him, you're not ready. You're just not ready.
Right.
Like, you're just not ready. If you're an alcoholic and you want to keep a six-pack in your house, we all know where that's going to go.
Right. Yeah.
If you're a severe alcoholic, maybe a mild alcoholic can get away with it, but if you're a severe alcoholic, you can't keep a six-pack or a bottle of vodka in your house. And well, it's the same thing, because people say, well, it's food people need to survive. Well, you don't need all types of food to survive. There's usually trigger foods, right? These people aren't eating a chicken breast and eating 70 of them,
Yeah.
There's certain types of foods that are triggers, and breaking that emotional bond with those foods is tough, and I can talk to them about that and discuss what I know about it. But even if they're working with a mental health professional or somebody who's an expert in psychology, it comes down to them. They got to be ready to do the hard things.
Yeah.
If you eat an entire gallon of ice cream in one sitting, guess what? If you're serious about not being as heavy as you are, you can't keep a gallon of ice cream in your freezer anymore. Those days are over. And if it's not today and you need a year or two of eating more gallons of ice cream, then I guess you just need a year or two to figure it out. That's not great for your health, but that just might be what it takes. Sometimes things just take time, and there are trade-offs to that, and some of that comes at the expense of your health. But, if you do it in 2 years instead of 5, you're better off. Like, you just got to kind of reframe the problem, right? But if you are the type of person that can't have ice cream without eating the entire gallon, this is an exaggeration, obviously. You can insert whatever food you want here. I know some people that drink entire cases of soda, they're like 300-400 pounds,
Sure.
But part of the formula to reversing the weight gain, or the high BMI, high fat percentage, high body weight, whatever you want to call it, is you have to part ways with some of those things.
Yeah, and it's a tall order. I mean, it
is, and it's a process. I'm not saying, when I say that, I do not mean you have to do this right now.
Right.
But
yes,
it's part of the formula, no matter how it makes you feel. Just like you have to squat when you want to vomit and when you feel like you have no control over it, and yet it looks right in the video.
Yeah,
it's the same thing.
right.
Sometimes you have to do things that elicit emotions you don't like. I'm sorry. It's part of life if you want to advance, grow, and progress in an area, right? Like there's an emotional reality with that you have to confront.
Yeah. Yep. I saw recently something, it's probably on Instagram. It's like, you're uncomfortable because you're growing, but hey, you're growing, so you're going to be uncomfortable. Like it's okay. That's actually, it's an okay thing, but you have to learn how to be okay with being uncomfortable.
Right.
I know, talking to, or listening to Dr. Pewter, I produce his podcast, Psychology and Psychotherapy. I'm sorry, the Psychiatry and Psychotherapy podcast. And he's talked about, psychotherapy on a lot of episodes. It's a huge component of his podcast. And there are patients he's worked with that he's needed to work with for years until they get a breakthrough. Now, these are generally people with some pretty severe issues, some pretty severe mental health challenges. But, the point is it can take time, and this is no different. I find this is one of the most difficult areas of coaching for me, at least, is I get people who are looking for help, and I realize that the problem is something I can't help with. Like they need help. Like I'm like, I feel like I'm a bucket of water in the middle of a massive firestorm, like I can help them get strong, but that's not the totality of what they need. It's a small piece of the overall puzzle. Maybe not a small piece, but it's just one piece of the overall puzzle. And that's hard, when they only have sought your help, and I can just tell they need more. That's a difficult spot to be in, but yeah, for sure. I always suspect that there's things like that going on where I don't know if it's conscious or not, but there's some sort of self-destructive snacking behavior going on where, it's pretty easy to erase all of the gains you've made, so to speak. Like you said in the past, if you eat great Monday through Thursday, but then Friday, Saturday, Sunday is a disaster, it's easy to completely erase whatever deficit you've created over the previous 4 days, right? And
that's right.
And you find yourself, maybe you didn't lose anything, maybe you gained as a result.
Yeah, and understanding that and being honest with yourself about it, even if that means you want to keep doing it for now, is the most important thing. There's no skirting around this.
Right.
Some people can't drink alcohol because they drink too much no matter what.
Yeah.
It has addictive like properties. Certain foods can. So I'm sorry you love chocolate, but if you eat an entire box of it, no matter what type of chocolate touches your tongue, then it's probably bad for you. Chocolate's not bad for everybody, but for the guy who's going to, eat 2 boxes of it just because it touched his tongue, it's probably bad for him.
Yeah.
Right. And is he going to be able to moderate? Okay, there's outliers. Sure. There's probably outliers that can moderate, that have those problems, but that is not the norm. Most of the time, if you eat something and don't stop eating it, you're always going to not stop eating it. Let's just be realistic here and just look at it statistically. The probability that you will eat an entire gallon of ice cream, if you've always eaten an entire gallon of ice cream, is very high. So do you want to play with those odds? You can, you'll just stay heavy, and that's fine. Nobody's, being heavy is not right or wrong. There's a healthy, unhealthy argument to be made, sure. But right and wrong is, something you got to decide,
Yeah.
We're not going to sit here and say you're an asshole because you eat like a sack of shit.
Right. It's not moralizing. I think that's important to say. Like we're having this discussion because people will come to us wanting to lose weight and have struggled with that and failed in the past. And so, usually that's where we're starting this conversation, is they've stated the goal of losing weight in the first place. And so that's their goal that they've come up with. And so we're trying to figure out a way to get there.
Right. And I don't think I share any information on diet that other people don't. Some people try to use gimmicks to make money. I don't do that. But what I do tell people is that, hey, you're just going to stay fat with those habits,
Yeah, right.
I try to be straightforward with people, like there's one guy, literally, like I don't change my message week to week. I give them different forms of it, but it's the same message. Dude, you're snacking too much. You have too much shit in your house. And then, you get the answer that, oh, well, I don't live alone. Other people live here. And I'm like, well, now you got a bigger problem. Like, I am not afraid to say that, hey, if you are a big fat person and you're feeding your kids shit, maybe you should reconsider the example you're trying to set,
Right. Yeah.
I have no problem saying that. And if you have a problem with me saying that, well, there's other shows to listen to. There's other people to hire. Because
right.
at the end of the day, you are the leader of your home, right? So that doesn't matter if you're male or female, your mom or the dad. If you're trying to put yourself on a diet, but everyone else is eating like shit, reconsider that. That's a conversation that needs to be had. And it doesn't mean that everybody needs to be in a strict diet. And, I know you're going to say, oh, fuck you, Santana, you live alone. Sure, fair enough. Trent doesn't, so you can chime in. But my point is, things work, I always hear that phrase thrown around, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with,
Yeah, right.
I hear that one thrown around a lot. But, what I get from it is, you kind of adopt the habits of the people you're around, and that can go both ways, right? So if it's important to you to eat healthy and not be super overweight and snacking is a problem, everybody's got to be on board, and if everybody's not on board, then maybe being heavy is not the worst thing in the world for you, because obviously there are a lot of other things in your life that you have to balance that against, right? So again, It's not a morality thing, right, wrong thing.
Right.
My whole thing is that you're coming to me with a goal that really kind of requires everybody that you live with to be on the same page.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting if you've never done this. Have you ever stayed with someone who is very fit and what we would consider to have very healthy eating habits for an extended period of time? Like, have you ever spent like a weekend or a whole week with somebody like that? I'm sure you have.
Are you talking to me?
Yeah. Well, I'm kind of speaking rhetorically, but yeah, I'm sure you have, right? But I remember some experiences of being in my 20s and getting out in the world more, experiencing more people than just the people I grew up with, people I met in college. And I've been able to spend weekends, whole weeks with people who are, in the upper tiers of fitness and certainly healthy eating habits, right? Sort of the upper quartile or whatever. And it's interesting what kind of commonalities you see. I think one of them is these people all are very active. They all walk, at least 10,000 steps a day, probably closer to 15,000. If we're going somewhere, we're walking there, or we're going to ride our bikes. Not a whole lot of car time, unless we're taking an extended trip. There's usually a lot of, like whatever activities we're going to do, it involves some sort of walk or, getting out. It's like, hey, let's go hang out. Let's go play on the slack line at the park. Cool. So we're going to walk a couple miles at the park, set up the slack line, mess around. It's just all physically active play. And the other thing is, I find that most of these people, they cook all their own food. So if you want something to eat, if you're hungry, the only grab and go stuff available is usually like fruit. There's like an apple or a banana or whatever, or an orange. But if you want something more substantial than that, you're going to have to cook something or prepare it. It's not just like, there's nothing to just grab that's a more meaty snack. And I know that in our own household, as we have drifted more and more in that direction, where like the stuff that we have is stuff that we have to prepare or bake or cook or whatever, the better our body composition has been, because it does kind of naturally eliminate that snacking problem that you're talking about. It's kind of hard to have a trigger food when it's like, oh yeah, I really want that, but I gotta wait for 6-7 minutes for the water to boil first, and then I gotta cook it, and then
Yeah, that's right. If you create barriers for yourself and don't make it easy to get that stuff,
yeah, right,
you have better outcomes.
Yeah,
on accident,
right? Yeah, but that's it's kind of funny. It's kind of some commonalities that I see amongst people who I've spent a lot of time with. And that's something you don't really see from the outside in. You know, you don't really, unless you actually like spend like a whole day with a person, you don't really know what their life's like in terms of their eating habits.
You know, it's funny. I think of this, on this topic of, your environment, because, it's nature versus nurture thing. Obviously there's genetics, that's your foundation, but then your environment and your actions influence the outcomes of what you're doing as well. You can't make somebody who's a motor moron an elite athlete, obviously, but you can make them less of a motor moron, and this can apply to anything. So I think about an interview that Rip did with Marty Gallagher. I think it was 12 years ago. And he told Rip, he's like, and I'm going to use a lifting analogy here, obviously. He's like, if you're squatting 600 and everyone else around you is squatting 315, then that's a whole lot less incentive than you can't go on the big man platform unless you have at least a 7 squat, right?
Yeah.
And then he goes on, and he's like, but you know what? Those guys on the number 4 platform, they're watching when, who the hell is he talking about? I can't remember. Somebody clean and jerking 400 at 198, Was it Bill Cassidy? Does that sound right?
Yeah, I don't know.
Or, shit, I have to listen to the interview again. But anyways, it's true. So like, I worked out at lifting gyms before, and obviously the guys had better genetics and were on drugs. So they were lifting a lot more than me. But the point is they were competitive, and that competitive energy spreads. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So it's like, it's not so much that, okay, I can't go work out over there because I don't have a 700 squat, so I better work up to a 700 squat. It's that the guys over there that are squatting at least 7, they're trying to scrape every last pound on there and get 8, 9, 1,000, whatever, depending on what gym you're talking about. But when you're in that environment where these guys are doing whatever it takes to get stronger, you start adopting that, you feed off of that. And and the same thing applies to what we're talking about here. If you're eating well 5 days a week, and then you're eating out or snacking on the weekends, and everyone else around you is doing it, then it feels more normal than, if you're around a bunch of guys that take this stuff seriously. You know what I mean? And that's not neurotic eating disordered bodybuilder people, and some of those guys are naturally lean and don't have eating disorders, by the way. Not every bodybuilder has an eating disorder. Some of them are very well suited for that and don't have to diet that hard enough to get on stage, but some people really, they go crazy trying to get that lean. There's a lot of eating disorders in bodybuilding that's not really disputed even in those circles. So I'm not sitting here trying to make this about that. But what I'm saying is if you're around people that have pretty good habits, they stop eating when they're full, they leave leftovers if they don't want more, they take stuff home, they don't keep a lot of snacks in the house, you start adopting some of that, you feed off of that, It's just like, if you're lifting around a bunch of guys that are much stronger than you and are competitive and work hard, you're going to do it too.
Yep. It's such a powerful thing. It just sets a baseline for you that's different. It's amazing what you can get, it's amazing what you can normalize, in terms of like how you frame things. Like, oh, that's really heavy, man. 315, that's really heavy. Well, yeah, I'm sure a lot of people think that, but then you're like, oh, okay, well, that's not really very heavy, is it? It's amazing how that baseline that you have for, everything can be shifted. Your baseline can be shifted up or down very easily.
If you're around a bunch of guys that are, bench pressing your deadlift, then you're not going to be that scared of it, and that's what Rip was talking about. He's like, I was scared of 600. I had this in my mind, and Marty's like, well, you wouldn't be if you saw guys benching it on a regular basis. And they're like, oh, it's, no big deal. It's just 600,
Yeah, exactly.
And, that applies to anything, like just pick your endeavor. If you want to get good at a musical instrument, you got to play around people that are good at music and also competitive, because there are naturals that just don't have work ethic,
Right.
What you want to be around is the guy that's awesome, but also works his ass off,
Right. Yes. Yeah.
Because if you can't get the ability because you lack the genetics for it, you can absorb the work ethic.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's all the more fun too.
It is. Yeah. I was about to say, I mean, that has its own rewards outside of the, the strength and muscle you get.
I mean, today I was at a dog kennel for most of the day. It was a slow day here. So I did all my online coaching in the morning, then mid-morning around 11 noon, around noon. It was around noon. I went to the dog kennel, spent like 3 hours there. and just watched them train dogs. You know, I didn't do anything. I just watched and absorbed it. And then I came back here and applied some of it in between my lifting and before I got on this show. But I'm just applying that principle. I'm like, if I want to get good at this, I got to immerse myself in that environment as much as I can. You know, right now for that, it's just once a week. I don't want to go into someone's place of business all the time, but you know, they're my friends, and they invite me to do that. And then the owner always explains, okay, this is why we're doing this, this, and this. And he's like, I'm glad you stayed for that one. That one's good for you because your dog does some of that stuff. And I want to push it, I want to push it. So I'm trying to spend time around it. I try to spend time around people. I invite them here, to bring their dogs into my gym and use it for various drills, So it just, that's where really what it comes down to, if you really want to get good at something, you got to do the work, but you also got to immerse yourself in the environment, whatever that may be.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, there you go. So, we haven't dedicated an episode to the obese person who's looking to lose weight. But it's not really any different in principle to anyone else who's trying to lose weight. But the challenges are certainly greater in a lot of cases. There might be bigger behavioral changes you need to make. There may be more hurdles you have to overcome to make those changes. And we certainly recognize that it's not easy. None of this stuff we're saying is easy, but it's not complicated either. It's pretty simple.
Sorry, people. Easy doesn't work.
Yeah, easy doesn't work. Easy doesn't work. And, we wouldn't want it to work either, right?
No,
life would be very unrewarding if all these results were easy to get.
Look, I thought I slam dunked on the bench 2 weeks ago. I got 310 for 5 off the pins after 3 months of troubleshooting it. 312 and a half today, 4. So I was so pissed, but I was most pissed because I'm like, well, now I got to keep fucking troubleshooting this till it cooperates,
right?
Because I told, and then, Will's getting in my ear about what he's suggesting. And I'm like, well, I will get rid of the pin bench when I do 315 for 5.
Yeah, sure.
So
sure.
I got to somehow eke out these last 2.5 to 5 pounds, and we'll figure it out. But
yeah, it's going to make it sweeter. It's going to make the victory.
Hey, look, I don't stress about deadlifting anymore. But when I was obsessed with 500, man, whew, that frustration.
Oh yeah.
But I learned, and I help others do it, so it's worth it.
That's right. Yep. Well, there you go. There's another episode. Why don't we sign it off?
One for the books. All right. You can find me at weightsandplates.com or on Instagram at _Robert_Santana. Or you can find us on YouTube now, youtube.com/@weights_and_plates. If you're in Phoenix, Metro Phoenix, and want some one-on-one coaching or a gym membership, we are just south of Sky Harbor Airport off 32nd Street and Broadway. Weights and Plates Gym. Come on by or visit us on Instagram. Weights_and_plates.
Bam. There you go. You know where to find me. I'm on Instagram at marmalade_cream. And I'm also available via email if you have any coaching questions, jonesbarbellclub@gmail.com. All right, we'll talk to you again in a couple of weeks.